As the murmurs of the crowd around her swirled like the winds that swept through the forum, Agrippina stood there, silent. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken expectations. Her children at her side, she felt their eyes upon her, waiting for her reaction. The bronze tablet gleamed in the sunlight, its inscriptions cold and unyielding, a sharp reminder of her husband's death and her own dismal standing in the eyes of the Senate. The Senatus Consultum Denius Pisone Patre, passed by the Senate on December 10th, was ordered to be distributed across the Roman Empire, prominently displayed in the forums of most towns and cities. Intended as a public record, the bronze tablet outlined the Senate's decisions regarding Piso and his family, presenting them as fair and just, but carefully aligned with Tiberius's political agenda. This decree, supported by Tiberius, was now the official narrative to be accepted by Romans across the empire, and there was nothing Agrippina could do to change it. On the tablet, Piso's crimes were listed: hostile behaviour towards Germanicus, mismanagement of Syria, and attempts to incite unrest among the legions. But of murder, the crime that had shattered Agrippina's world and torn apart her children's futures, there was no mention. Neither were the charges of witchcraft and sorcery brought against Piso's wife, Plancina, recorded. Piso's suicide was portrayed as an admission of guilt, his punishment framed as necessary, yet mitigated by Tiberius's mercy. To the people of Rome, it was a clean conclusion, a death and a trial wrapped up in the language of justice and fairness. But Agrippina knew the truth. The whispers among the people gnawed at her, their faces twisted in disgust as they muttered about a grandmother who would protect the murderer of her own grandson. Those whispers were growing louder, echoing through Rome like the winds in the Forum. And such hostility could be expressed openly because Tiberius Caesar, also suspected in the death of Germanicus, had left Rome soon after the passing of the Senate's decree, abandoning the consular term he shared with his son to take refuge on Rhodes. Agrippina felt his absence keenly. With Tiberius gone, she was left vulnerable. The pain of Germanicus's death was still fresh, but now she was left with an emptiness that was even more unbearable, the absence of true protection. Despite the conclusion to Piso's trial, Agrippina's father-in-law had not fared well. He had refused to condemn Piso's memory, instead freeing his wife and sons. The questions surrounding Germanicus's death and Tiberius's role in it began to grow louder. Even the triumph awarded to Tiberius's son Castor had done little to sway public opinion back in Tiberius's favour. Castor, the new heir who would displace Agrippina's son, rode proudly in his 4-horse quadriga, waving to crowds who felt compelled to applaud because he was the emperor's son. Then, just days after the triumph, Castor's mother, Vipsania, sister to Agrippina, died suddenly in her home. It was a personal blow to Tiberius, who had been forced to divorce her in order to marry Agrippina's mother. The spectre of grief only compounded the growing unrest that surrounded his reign. Then came the next trial. Aemilia Lepida, the granddaughter of the triumvir, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and sister to Manius Aemilius Lepidus, who had represented Plancina at trial, found herself charged with attempted poisoning, astrology, false paternity, and, of course, treason. The charges were brought by her former husband, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius, a personal friend of Tiberius. Aemilia's story was tied to Agrippina's family. When she was young, Aemilia had been betrothed to Agrippina's brother, Lucius Caesar. After Lucius's death in Gaul, Aemilia was given in marriage to Quirinius as a reward for his service to Agrippina's other brother, Gaius Caesar. But the marriage did not last. Quirinius, already in his 50s, had little patience for a teenage bride and divorced her a few years later. But Aemilia, who was pregnant, bore Quirinius a daughter, and it was this daughter, now the spitting image of Aemilia's current husband, Mamercus Aemilius Scaurus, that became the centre of Quirinius's accusation. Now, in his 70s, and nearing death, Quirinius claimed the daughter was not his child, but the product of a secret affair. To protect his wealth and legacy from passing through this girl into the hands of Aemilia's husband, Quirinius pressed charges, accusing Aemilia of attempting to acquire his wealth through an illegitimate heir, and even of using astrology and poison to expedite the process. Because there was no basis for it in a paternity trial, Tiberius immediately dismissed the charge of treason. And after the criticism he had received for confiscating slaves during the Scribonius-Libo trials, and selling them to a third party so as to circumvent the law that prevented slaves from testifying against their owners, Tiberius did not confiscate the slaves of Aemilia Lepida. He did, however, allow the testimony of Quirinius's slaves against her, who happened to recall, after 15 long years, that she in fact had attempted to poison Quirinius during their marriage. It did not take long for the Senate to find Aemilia Lepida guilty. Her sentence: exile. However, the fallout of that decision, like the trials of Piso and of Agrippina's cousins, the Scribonius-Libo brothers, fell on Tiberius. During the Ludi Romani, while enjoying a play held in the theatre of Pompey, Tiberius was confronted by Aemilia Lepida and a group of prominent women. Aemilia, a noble descendant of Pompeius Magnus, the general who built the theatre, entered ceremoniously, surrounded by her women. There, before a hushed crowd, Aemilia fell on her knees before Tiberius, interrupting the play on the stage. Aemilia Lepida cried out to Tiberius for mercy, reminding all present of her illustrious heritage as a woman once worthy of the highest honours, including marriage to Augustus's grandson, Lucius Caesar. With all eyes on him, from the actors standing dumbfounded on stage to those in the audience who watched with bated breath, Tiberius said nothing, enduring their blank stares with a stony face until Aemilia Lepida and her women finally left the theatre. When the Senate met again, however, Tiberius did not mitigate Aemilia's punishment. She was exiled from Rome. Soon after, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius died. Because Aemilia Lepida had been found guilty of passing off another man's child as his heir, and because he had not yet drawn up a new will, Quirinius died intestate, and his wealth passed directly to the state and to Tiberius. Now, the people of Rome whispered that the trial of Aemilia Lepida, for a crime allegedly committed 15 years earlier, had been managed so that Tiberius could get his hands on Quirinius's wealth. And so, Tiberius, following a year of political trials, plummeting popularity, and the death of his beloved Vipsania, delivered a eulogy for Germanicus in the Senate, and then left Rome. A week later, following Tiberius' departure, his son Castor delivered a eulogy of his own for Germanicus. The Senate, eager to solidify the new narrative, decided that the pair of eulogies should also be preserved in bronze and posted across the empire. Tiberius's eulogy, which he had paid a poet named Clutorius Priscus to write for him, would be preserved for future generations, while Castor's eulogy would reflect the love and admiration he had held for his brother. Agrippina's face pinched. Politics, diplomacy, and emotional manipulation. Castor was merely trying to inch his way into the void left by the death of her husband. It was clear to Agrippina that he sought to win over the loyalty of the Rhine and Syrian legions that had been loyal to her husband, and add them to the Pannonian legions whose loyalty he had earned himself. Now that Castor was the father of 2 sons, one named Germanicus, Agrippina feared her own son Nero would be pushed from the succession to the favour of Tiberius's biological family. And Castor wasn't the only one trying to position himself as the heir to Germanicus's legacy. Agrippina's brother-in-law Claudius had also made a move in the same direction. The name Germanicus, which Agrippina's husband had glorified, was an honorific cognomen bestowed by the Senate on his father, Nero Claudius Drusus, as a reward for his earlier expansion into Germania. Because cognomens passed to the sons, both Germanicus and Claudius had the right to use the name. And it was well known that it had been Claudius who had raised the funds needed by his brother to quell the mutiny that had taken place on the Rhine. But Claudius, unlike his brother, did not fulfill the traditional Roman image of strength and dominance. Where Germanicus had been charismatic, Claudius was an intellectual. Germanicus had been filled with vim and vigour, the epitome of power and masculinity. Claudius, however, stuttered when he spoke and limped on a club foot. Physically weak, Claudius had always needed someone of strength to stabilize his own position within the imperial family. That person had been his brother, Germanicus. But now, with Germanicus gone, Claudius had turned to an unexpected ally, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Claudius's 13-year-old son Drusillus was formerly betrothed to Junilla, the 4-year-old daughter of Sejanus. With the legal right to use her late husband's name, Agrippina's brother-in-law now enjoyed the support of the Praetorian Guard as he raced against Castor to assume the support that had once belonged to Germanicus. But Agrippina had to wonder, was Claudius, so unassuming, so overlooked, smarter than she realized? Since their return from quelling the mutiny in Pannonia, Castor and Sejanus were not on friendly terms. Castor had even struck Sejanus on the face and in front of witnesses. After being publicly humiliated, Sejanus would not help Castor, especially with Tiberius out of Rome. Perhaps Claudius's alliance with Sejanus would prove more beneficial than Agrippina could have imagined. By securing Sejanus, Claudius brought the house of Germanicus under the protection of the Praetorian Guard. Even his mother, Antonia, who often criticized his shortcomings, supported the betrothal. And Agrippina was a widow. She had no authority of her own. The support of the people stood behind her, but they had also stood behind her mother Julia and her sister Julilla. And look what happened to them. Agrippina needed a protector. More than ever she realized her position, and her son Nero's future was under threat. And Claudius was more likely to honor the sons of his brother than was Castor, whose growing influence was pushing him to claim Germanicus's legacy for himself. Claudius was the safer choice. Then a scream shattered Agrippina's thoughts. It had come from the peristyle garden. A commotion ensued as Agrippina, along with members of the family and household staff, rushed to the center of the villa. There, laying on the ground, his face blue and eyes staring blankly at the sky, was Drusillus, Claudius's only son.